As I was getting ready for this, I did some homework. I wanted to try to remind myself of who's out there that's been working on this and how long have they been doing it. If you stop to think about it, people have been trying to deal with the problem of racial equality pretty much ever since this country became a nation. There were people, I made myself a list, and I'll read the list real quickly, and this is in the form of a handout. You can pick it up if you haven't already. But these were just names that popped into my head in no particular order. There's Martin King, Stokely Carmichael, Rap Brown. Anybody know whatever happened to Rap Brown? Anybody know that he got elected and ended up being a representative of the in Congress? Cesar Chavez, Rosa Parks, Miles Horton. Anybody know who Miles Horton is? I know one person here that does. Victoria Gray, my neighbor and friend who ran for Congress and only just recently died. Emmett Till. Who's Emmett Till? Anybody remember? What happened to him? Yeah, he got dumped in a river. Yeah.
It's part of Chicago.
I believe so. Yeah. Medgar Evers, that's the name most of us know. He had a little harder time trying to go to school, and it cost him his life. Relani Young, Malcolm X, Andrew Young. Andrew was simply one of the lieutenants in Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but as we all know, he did a few other things on down the line. Bob Moses, a math teacher from Harvard. Marion Wright Edelman. Some of you might know who she is. She was visiting here back in October. She was personally responsible for getting me out of jail more than once. Dennis Banks, Fannie Lou Hamer, Vernon Damer. Vernon was a good friend of mine. I used to roast peanuts in front of his fireplace and talk about all this sort of stuff with him, right up until the Klan burned his house down and he died. Russell Means, Frederick Douglass, Julian Bond, Jesse Jackson, Leonard Pelletier, Fool's Crow, Alex Haley, Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Ross Tubman, Marcus Garvey, Ralph Bunche. And when I wrote down Ralph Bunche's name, I got to thinking, now he also received the Nobel Peace Prize, but it was long ago. And then I got to thinking, how many black people have ever gotten the Nobel Peace Prize? How many of you happen to know or could even hazard a guess as to how many others besides Ralph and Martin might have gotten a Nobel Peace Prize? I can't hear you.
Desmond Tutu?
Desmond Tutu, yeah. I was surprised to discover this list. This is what came out of a little working on the web. Albert John Luthuli, and then of course Martin, and Sir William Arthur Lewis, Economic Prize, Desmond Tutu, Peace Prize. I don't even know how to pronounce this. Wole Soyinka, 1986 Literature Prize. Durley Walcott, Literature. Toni Morrison, Literature. Nelson Mandela, Peace Prize. Kofi Annan, Peace Prize. And Wangari Maathai, 2004. All of those people. Somehow this shouldn't surprise us, but I think it does. At least it surprised me, because somehow I hadn't paid attention to that. I guess another important point to try to get, just to keep things in focus, is that long before the summers of 1964 and 65 and 66, which made a special kind of history in America because of the intensity of the civil rights movement during those years, long before those years, Dr. King was already at work doing this sort of stuff. I want to quickly read you the history, the biography that the Nobel people put out. I think I'm going to read it to you. Maybe I'm, yeah, I am. I am going to read it to you. This is important because the point that it makes for me is that the difference between almost any of the other people who are on that list and this man was, I guess, what I'd call his staying power and consistency. How long and how single-mindedly he was at work on the whole issue of racial equality, and then other related issues as time went on. In 1957, let's see, whoops, wait a minute. I guess I'm not going to read it to you because...
Flip it over, Bob.
All right, thanks, Joan. Okay, 1929 to 1968. He was born Michael Luther King Jr., but later had his name changed to Martin. His grandfather began his family's long tenure as pastors of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, serving from 1914 to 1931. His father has served from then until the present, and that's not this present, it's the present of when this was written back at the time of his Nobel Prize. And from 1960 until his death, Martin Luther acted as co-pastor. Martin Luther attended segregated public schools in Georgia. Graduating from high school at the age of 15, he received the BA degree in '48 from Morehouse College, a distinguished Negro institution of Atlanta, from which both his father and grandfather had been graduated. After 3 years of theological study at Crozier Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, where he was elected president of the predominantly white senior class, he was awarded his Bachelor of Divinity in 1951. With a fellowship won at Crozier, he enrolled in graduate studies at Boston University, completing his residence for doctorate in 1953, receiving the degree in '55. In Boston, he met and married Coretta Scott, a young woman of uncommon intellectual and artistic attainments. 2 sons and 2 daughters were born into the family. In 1954, Martin Luther King accepted the pastorate of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Always a strong worker for civil rights for members of his race, King was, by this time, a member of the executive committee of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the leading organization of its kind in the nation. He was ready then, early in December '55, to accept the leadership of the first great Negro nonviolent demonstration of contemporary times in the United States, the bus boycott, described by Gunnar Jan in his presentation speech in honor of the laureate. The boycott lasted 382 days. On December 21st, '56, after the Supreme Court of the United States had declared unconstitutional laws requiring segregation on buses, Negroes and whites rode the buses as equals. During these days of boycott, King was arrested, his home was bombed, he was subjected to personal abuse, but at the same time, he emerged as Negro leader of the first rank. In '57, he was elected president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization formed to provide new leadership for the now burgeoning civil rights movement. The ideals for this organization he took from Christianity, its operational techniques from Gandhi. In the 11-year period between 1957 and '68, King traveled over 6 million miles and spoke over 2,500 times, appearing wherever there was injustice, protest, and action, And meanwhile, he wrote 5 books as well as numerous articles. In these years, he led a massive protest in Birmingham, Alabama that caught the attention of the entire world, providing what he called a coalition of conscience and inspiring his letter from the Birmingham jail, a manifesto of the Negro Revolution. He planned the drives in Alabama for the registration of Negroes as voters. He directed the peaceful march on Washington, D.C. of 250,000 people to whom he delivered his address, I Have a Dream. He conferred with President John F. Kennedy, campaigned for President Lyndon B. Johnson. He was arrested upward of 20 times and assaulted at least 4 times. He was awarded 5 honorary degrees, was named Man of the Year by Time magazine in 1963, and became not only the symbolic leader of American blacks, but also a world figure. At the age of 35, Martin Luther King Jr. was the youngest man to have received the Nobel Peace Prize. When notified of his selection, he announced that he would turn over the prize money of $54,123 to the furtherance of the Civil Rights Movement. On the evening of April 4th, 1968, while standing on the balcony of his motel room in Memphis, Tennessee, where he was to lead a protest march in sympathy with striking garbage workers of that day, of that city, he was assassinated. So there you have it, on 2 sides of 1 sheet of paper. What a life. Now, when you take that and place it against 4 or 5 years that I spent in Mississippi, you can see why I don't have a whole lot to say about all of Martin Luther King. All I have is a couple of anecdotes about places where his path happened to cross mine, or better yet, mine happened to cross his. I'd like to talk about those things with you a little bit. Again, I guess to precede that, I'd place one other thing in context. Through those years of the mid to late 60s, Dr. King didn't spend very much time in Mississippi, almost none. And you might be wondering why. 2 reasons. Probably the simplest and most obvious was he was busy elsewhere. But the other reason was because an actual division of labor, an agreement among civil rights organizations was carved out in 1964, well actually beginning in 1963, which gave the primary responsibility for overseeing the civil rights activities in Mississippi to another organization that you may have heard of called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Having that particular agreement put together placed a really different flavor on the work in Mississippi than the work in some of the other states. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was what it sounds like it was. Students, primarily. Many of them as young, probably younger than some of you sitting in this room today, who simply interrupted their education, many of them at good, probably even influential colleges in the North, and came to Mississippi to live literally hand to mouth and to work on projects. And I'll talk a little bit about what kind of projects after a bit. The philosophy of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was to focus on grassroots organizing, to deal with and live with and work with the poorest of the poor. Dr. King, as you can see from the material that we've shared already, came from a well-educated family, a family like many others in the South, who I guess you would want to call the Negro or the black upper crust, people who lived in comfortable homes and whose values were pretty much identical to the values that you would find from people in other parts of society. And my whole experience in Mississippi, and actually everywhere I've been since then, tells me that people who have the benefit of a comfortable life and a good education approach all these issues quite differently than people that don't. And so the flavor of the civil rights movement in Mississippi was really quite different than the flavor of the parts of the civil rights movement that were led by and involved people who were better educated. I guess another piece that goes with that is simply an observation, and that is that in the Deep South, there were very, very few black pastors or black teachers or other black professionals who got personally involved in civil rights, even when it was going on right literally under their noses and in their communities. Why? Not because their values weren't supportive of it, but because it was literally seen as too costly, too risky to do. A student or a teacher in a black high school that supported the students in a boycott of the school was no longer a teacher there. And it didn't take very long, like hours. A black pastor who allowed his church to be used for mass meetings would find the church burned to the ground the next day. I have so many examples and stories of that I'd probably bore you by the time I told all of them. There are books with picture after picture after picture of chimneys, just chimneys, brick chimneys, sticking up in the air, because that's all that's left after whatever building it was burned to the ground. That's what Vernon Damer's house looked like. All that was left was the big brick chimney that we used to sit in front of when we cooked, when we roasted our peanuts. I don't say anything really negative or critical of black professional people in observing that they were missing on the front lines. I'm just simply saying that's the way it was, and there are good reasons for most people about why that's the way it was. People who had less to lose simply said, all right, let's go for it. Beyond all of that, though, I think I have to say a little bit about what got me down there in the first place. My first visit to Mississippi at the time of the civil rights movement took me from Chicago to Greenwood, Mississippi, actually during Holy Week of 1964. And I went there because other pastors that I knew in Illinois had gone down to Hattiesburg in January. The reason they were there was because it had been learned that if pastors from the north came, it accomplished two things, maybe three. The two things that it accomplished for sure was that it brought TV cameras from the media with them. And so all of these events that were going on in Mississippi, which were largely unreported, became reported, because some pastor from Rockford, Illinois would go down there and maybe get arrested and maybe not, and then his hometown paper would write a story about him, and then the wire services, AP and so forth, would pick it up, and it would get published. The second thing that happened was there was less violence. The people who were largely young men, just kind of rebel-rousing guys who would show up at these marches with rocks and sticks and bricks, kicking people and beating people, tended not to do that when there were a half a dozen or a dozen pastors Now, I come from a denomination that doesn't always wear a collar. I was told when I went, get one. And I did, because that was the visual sign. Instead of wearing a sign that said, I'm an ordained minister, I just put a collar on it, and that took care of that.